welcome back to This is Thailand. Now look, if you've been watching this channel for a while, you know the drill. Someone comes here looking for something. Paradise, maybe. A fresh start, love, peace and quiet after a life that stopped making sense. And somewhere along the way, Thailand takes it from them. Usually fast. Usually brutal. Usually obvious in hindsight. This one's different. This is the story of a man called Bazza. He's 65 now. He's from Queensland, up in the north of Australia. Spent over 3 decades in the merchant marine cargo ships, long hauls, the kind of life where you're gone for months and home for weeks, and you just keep doing it because that's what you do. By every measure, this is a man who knows the world. He's seen ports from one end of the Pacific to the other. He's not naive. He's not green. He's not the kind of bloke who falls for the first thing that looks good in the tropical light. And yet, this story spans 10 years. 10 years in Thailand. And by the end of it, Bazza lost something that I think is going to sit with you for a long time after you close this video. I'm not going to tell you what it is yet, but I will say this: when you hear how it happened, you're not going to be able to point at the moment it went wrong, because there wasn't one. That's what makes this one stick. So settle in. This one's going to take a bit. Here's his story, in his own words, right. So, where do I start with this? People always want me to start with Thailand. Everyone wants to jump straight to Thailand. But if I do that, none of it makes sense. So you've got to come back a bit further than that. Back to the sea, really. Because that's where everything starts, and that's where everything ended, before Thailand even entered the picture. I was on cargo ships for 32 years. Merchant marine. Out of Cairns, long-haul stuff mostly runs up through Southeast Asia. Over to the east coast of the States sometimes. Down to New Zealand. Big container vessels. The kind of work where you're away for 2 months, maybe 3, and then you're home for a few weeks, and then you're gone again. And you just do it. You don't think about it too much. It's just the shape of your life. And the thing about that shape of life is, you need something solid on the other end. Something that stays where you left it. For me, that was my wife. She was back in Cairns, holding the fort, as they say. She was the shore, I was the water. That's the simplest way I can put it, and I know it sounds a bit poetic for a bloke like me, but it's just the truth of it. She was the reason I always came back. And for most of those years, most of them, mind, she was healthy and laughing, and that house in Cairns was the warmest place on earth when I walked through the door. Then the diagnosis came. I'm not going to sit here and give you the whole story of that. It's not really what this is about, and frankly I'd rather not. What I will say is this. It wasn't fast. It wasn't the kind of thing where one day everything's fine and the next day it's not. It was slow. Years slow. And when something like that happens to someone you love, you don't just keep sailing off around the world like nothing's changed, do you? So I started pulling back, took shorter runs, then even shorter ones. Then I just stopped taking them altogether, phased myself out bit by bit, until one day I realized I hadn't been on a ship in months, and nobody had actually told me to stop. I just did. The last 4 years of her life were quiet. That's the word for it. Quiet, not peaceful, mind. There's a difference. Peaceful means you're at ease with something. Quiet just means the noise has stopped. And that's what it was. The house got quieter. The days got shorter somehow, even though they were the same length as always. I'd drive her to appointments. I'd come home and make dinner, and we'd sit and watch the telly, and sometimes she'd fall asleep in her chair, and I'd just sit there and watch her sleep and think, this is it now. This is what it is. People ask me what it was like, losing her. And I tell them the truth, which is that I didn't feel it the way you'd expect. Not at the funeral, anyway. I didn't cry, and I know that sounds cold, I know how it sounds, but here's the thing: I'd already done the grieving. I'd been grieving for 4 years while she was still alive. Every single day, a little bit more of her was going, and every single day I was saying goodbye to another piece of her, and by the time she actually went, I'd already said it 1,000 times. I wasn't sad when she went, I was just done. And that scared me more than the sadness would have, because the sadness, at least, means something. It means there was something there worth losing. Being done just means the tank's empty. And I didn't know how to fill it back up, didn't even know where to start looking. So I didn't. Not for a while. I just went through the motions. Weeks turned into months. The house sat there around me, and I rattled around in it like a marble in a tin can, and nothing felt like it belonged to me anymore. Not the furniture, not the kitchen, not the view out the back. It all just felt like props from a life that someone else had been living. And that's when I started thinking about selling up, not because I had somewhere to go. I didn't. I had no plan at all. I just knew I couldn't keep living in that house. It wasn't mine anymore. Not really. Not without her in it. So I sold it. Quicker than you'd think, actually. Didn't even bother haggling. Got a decent price, stuck the money somewhere safe, and that was that. 30-odd years of a life in Cairns, and I was done with it in about a fortnight. And that's how it starts, really. Not with a flight to Thailand, not with a plan. just with a man who'd run out of reasons to stay put and nowhere left to be. So I sold the house. And look, I know people hear that and they think it must have been this big emotional moment, packing up 30 years of memories, going through her things, all that, and maybe it should have been, but it wasn't. Not really. I just rang a bloke I knew who did property and I said, I want to sell, and he said, right, and about 2 weeks later it was done. I didn't even argue about the price. Whatever he got for it, he got for it. I couldn't have told you at the time what the place was worth, and I genuinely did not care. The money went into the account, and that was that. About $160,000, give or take, once everything was squared away. Decent chunk. Enough to live on for a long time if you're not stupid about it. And I wasn't stupid about it, not then, anyway. Now Thailand. People always ask me how I ended up there specifically. Like there was some moment of inspiration, some ad I saw, or some bloke at the pub who said, mate, you should try Thailand. And look, there was a bloke actually, old shipmate of mine called Davo Davo, retired to Chiang Mai about 3 years before I left Cairns, used to send me photos on the phone, little temple with golden bits on it, a plate of pad thai that looked like something out of a magazine, a beer on a balcony with the mountains behind it. Beautiful stuff. And I'd look at those photos and think, yeah, that looks all right. But it wasn't really about Davo's photos. It was more than that. See, I'd been docking in Southeast Asian ports my entire career. Singapore, Jakarta, Manila, Penang. I knew the region. I knew the way it felt. The heat when you walked off the gangway. The smell of it cooking and diesel and something sweet underneath that you could never quite identify. The pace of things. The way people moved through their days like there was no particular rush to get anywhere. I'd been watching that world for over 30 years from the outside, and somewhere in the back of my head I'd always thought, one day I might actually stay. So when I needed to go somewhere, when I just needed to not be in that house anymore, it wasn't really a decision. It was more like the obvious thing, the thing that had been sitting there the whole time, waiting. I flew into Bangkok in late 2014, and I'll be honest with you, Bangkok was too much. Straight away, too loud, too busy, too many people trying to get your attention for one thing or another. I'm not saying it's a bad place. It's not. It's incredible, actually. But I'd just come off the quietest few years of my life, and I needed something at the other end of the scale. So I spent about 3 days there, mostly just sleeping and eating street food and getting used to the humidity. And then I got on a bus south to Hua Hin. And that was it, really. That was the moment, not Bangkok, Hua Hin, because Hua Hin felt ripe in a way I didn't expect. It's coastal. It's got that same smell of salt air and fish that I'd known my whole working life, but it's warmer, obviously, and quieter than any port town I'd ever been in. The pace of it suited me immediately. People walked slowly. The market stalls opened in the morning and closed whenever they closed, and nobody seemed to be in a rush about any of it. The food was cheap. A plate of kalpad with prawns and a Chang beer cost you almost nothing. I could sit and eat and watch the street and feel like I was part of something without actually having to talk to anyone about it. I found a little apartment within the first week. Nothing fancy. A studio, really, on the second floor of a building near the waterfront. Tile floors, a fan that rattled a bit, a balcony that looked out over the rooftops toward the water. Rent was about 8,000 baht a month. That's roughly $230. Coming from Cairns, where I'd been paying a mortgage that ate half of everything, it felt almost absurd, like someone had made a mistake and forgotten to charge me properly. And so I just settled in, set up a routine, because that's what I do. That's what 32 years at sea teaches you. You find the structure, and you stick to it. Mornings I'd get up early, make coffee on the little gas stove, sit on the balcony and watch the light come up. Then I'd walk. Down to the waterfront, along the promenade, sometimes all the way to the beach and back. Nothing fast. Just moving. Then I'd eat something from one of the street stalls, muping, if it was a good morning, or some sticky rice and suntan if I felt like it. Afternoons were just afternoons, a book sometimes, a nap sometimes, a beer at the end of the day. Usually at a little cafe bar I found about a 10-minute walk from the apartment. The cafe was where I started to feel like I belonged somewhere, or at least like I was allowed to be somewhere without explanation. There were a few other older foreigners who drank there in the afternoons. An English bloke, a German fella, a couple of Americans. We didn't know each other well, didn't need to. We'd nod, maybe have a word about the weather or the football, and then just sit and be quiet. And that was fine. More than fine, actually. It was exactly what I needed. I want to be straight with you here, because people hear this story and they think, oh, he was lonely, he was desperate, he was an easy target. And yeah, all right, maybe there's some truth in that. But in those first few months, I genuinely wasn't looking for anything. I had the money, I had the apartment, I had the routine. Nobody was asking me for anything, and I wasn't asking anyone for anything. And for the first time in years, the days just passed without me dreading them. About 3 months in, I remember sitting at the cafe one afternoon, and a local bloke, one of the regulars, Thai fella, friendly enough, he looked at me and asked how long I was planning to stay. And I opened my mouth to say something like, a few more weeks, or until the end of the month, or something like that. Something sensible and temporary, but what came out was, haven't decided yet. And it was true. I hadn't. And that was the first time in a very long time that I'd said something like that out loud. Hadn't decided yet. No plan, no deadline, no one waiting for me to show up somewhere. It felt strange, but it didn't feel bad. I stayed another month, then another, and then it was 6 months, and I was still there, and I still hadn't decided. And at some point, I stopped asking the question altogether, because it turned out Thailand was very good at making you forget you'd ever needed an answer. So about a year in, I moved apartments. Now look, there was no real reason for it. The first place was fine, perfectly fine, good enough bed, worked out all right, close to the cafe and the waterfront. But I think that's exactly why I moved, if I'm being honest. It was fine. And fine started to feel like it was becoming permanent in a way that made me a bit uneasy. Like I was settling into something without having chosen it. 32 years at sea, you are always moving, always going somewhere new. And even though I'd come to Hua Hin specifically to stop moving, there was still something in me that got restless when things stayed too still for too long, so I found another place. A bit further back from the waterfront, quieter street, slightly cheaper. Same kind of setup, small, nothing fancy, tile floors and a fan and a balcony, but it was different enough to feel like a fresh start, which I suppose is what I was after without really knowing it. And that's where I met her. She managed the building, not the owner, the manager. Mid-40s, give or take. Neat, organized, the kind of woman who had a system for everything and didn't waste words explaining it. First time I saw her was when I came to pay the first month's rent. She took the money, counted it, gave me a receipt, and that was about it. Polite, efficient. Not unfriendly, but not trying to be your mate either. I liked that straight away, actually. After a year of not really talking to anyone properly, it was a relief to deal with someone who wasn't going out of their way to fill the silence. The first few weeks were just that, transactional. I'd come down to pay rent, she'd take it. Something needed fixing in the apartment, a tap, a dodgy light switch, I'd mention it, and she'd sort it, usually same day done, no fuss, no drama. And then one afternoon, about a month in, I needed to go to the immigration office to sort out something with my visa. Tourist visa stuff. Nothing complicated, but I'd heard the immigration offices in Hua Hin could be a bit of a maze if you didn't know what you were doing. And I didn't. Not really. I knew my way around every port from Singapore to Manila, but Thai bureaucracy was a different ocean altogether. I mentioned it to her in passing, didn't ask for help. Just said something like, I've got to go to immigration tomorrow, and I haven't got the faintest idea what I'm doing. And she looked at me and said, I go that way. I help you. Said it like it was the most obvious thing in the world, like helping a lost Farang navigate the local immigration office was just part of the job. So she came with me. And look, I'll tell you something that trip probably saved me weeks of messing about. She knew exactly where to go, who to talk to, what forms needed what. She did the talking when the talking needed doing, and she translated the bits I couldn't follow, and by the time we walked out of there it was all sorted. The whole thing took about an hour. I thanked her and she just shrugged and said, no problem. After that, it became a thing. Not every day, nothing like that. But whenever I needed to deal with something that required a bit of local knowledge, a phone call to a government office, a form that needed filling in, something at the local council, I'd ask her, and she'd help. And she never made a big deal of it. Never made me feel like I owed her anything or like she was doing me some huge favor. It was just what she did, quietly, practically, no drama. And I started to enjoy it, not just the help itself, but the company. Because here's the thing, she was easy to be around. Not in a flashy way, not in a way that demanded your attention or your conversation. She was just there, and it was comfortable. And after a year and a half of mostly talking to myself, or to a handful of other blokes at the cafe who weren't much for words either, that mattered more than I wanted to admit at the time. We started talking a bit more, not about anything heavy, the neighborhood, the weather, what was good at the market that morning. She had a dry sense of humor that caught me off guard. Sometimes she'd say something and I wouldn't realize it was a joke until half a second later, and then I'd laugh and she'd just smile and look away like she hadn't done anything. It felt natural, felt easy, and I want to be really clear about something here, because I know how this sounds. I know you're sitting there thinking, yeah, here it comes, the lonely old Farang falls for the Thai woman. Classic story, and maybe it is, maybe that's exactly what it was, but it didn't feel like that at the time. It didn't feel like a story at all. It just felt like two people who happened to get along. And one of them was useful to the other, and the other was grateful, and somehow that turned into something warmer without either of them really noticing it happen. There was no moment. No date, no dinner, no night where something shifted. It was more like the temperature changing between seasons. One day you realize it's warmer than it was last week, but you couldn't tell you exactly when it changed. Looking back now, I can see how that lack of a clear line made it harder to question later. If there's no obvious beginning, there's no obvious point where you can say, that's where it went wrong. But at the time, it just felt like the most natural thing in the world. It was about 4 or 5 months into knowing her when she mentioned, very casually, that her family home up in Isan needed some work done on the roof. A bit of water damage from the wet season. Nothing urgent, she said, but it needed fixing before it got worse. She wasn't asking me for anything. She said it the way you'd mention the weather, just a fact about her life, offered up in conversation. And I said, how much would that cost to fix? And she told me, about 7,000 baht, that's roughly $200, nothing, literally nothing, against what I had sitting in the account. And I said, I'll sort it, don't worry about it, just like that, no hesitation, no second thought. It felt like the right thing to do, like the obvious thing. You know someone, they need help, you can help them, so you do. Simple as that. She looked at me when I said it, and I'll never forget what she said. Her exact words were, you are not like the other Farangs. And I smiled. And I meant it when I said, yeah, well, I've been around a bit longer than most. She smiled back. And at the time, that little exchange felt like something. Like the start of something. Like a door opening. And it was. It just wasn't the kind of door I thought it was. Right. So this is where it starts to get a bit uncomfortable to talk about. Because this is the part where one stopped being a bloke who was just living quietly in Thailand and started being a bloke who was putting money into things. And the two feel very different when you're inside them. It's only when you look back that you realize how close together they actually were. It started with the business idea now. I want you to understand how this came about, because it matters. She didn't come to me one day and say, give me money, I want to start a business. That's not how it worked. Not at all. What happened was, we were sitting together one evening, this would have been sometime in early 2017, I think, and she was talking about the area near the market, how busy it got in the mornings, how there was a gap, she reckoned, for a small guest house. Nothing big. Just a few rooms, somewhere for tourists passing through who didn't want to pay the big hotel prices. She laid it out practically, calmly, the way you talk about the weather forecast. She'd clearly been thinking about it for a while. And I listened. And I thought, yeah, that actually makes sense. Because it did. I'd been in enough ports around the world to know what travelers want, and what she was describing was sensible, modest, objected. It wasn't some wild dream, it was a plan. So I asked her how much it would take to get started, and she gave me a figure. About 400,000 baht, that's roughly $11,000 or $12,000. Against the money I had sitting in the account, which was still well over 140,000 at that point, it felt like nothing. A drop. And more than that, it felt like something I wanted to be part of. Because here's what people don't talk about when they talk about retirement. The boredom of it. The feeling of being useless. I'd spent 32 years being useful, running cargo, moving things from one place to another, being part of a machine that actually did something. And then one day that stopped, and I was just a bloke sitting on a balcony drinking Chang in the afternoons, and the business idea gave me a role again. Investor.partner, someone with skin in the game. So I said yes. Of course I said yes. The money went across in a couple of payments. I didn't ask for a receipt. Looking back now, that's the first thing I'd do differently. But at the time, it didn't even occur to me. You don't ask for a receipt from someone you trust. And I trusted her, completely. She'd earned that trust, bit by bit, over 2 years of quiet reliability. So the money moved, and I felt good about it. And for a few months, everything seemed to be ticking along. She'd mentioned things, suppliers she'd spoken to, a spot she was looking at, and it all sounded reasonable. I didn't push for details. I wasn't that kind of investor. I was the kind who hands over the money and lets the other person get on with it. And then, about 3 months later, her mom got sick. Now, I want to be careful how I say this because I know what it sounds like. Sick, mum, classic. Everyone's heard that one. But here's the thing, at the time, it didn't sound like anything. It sounded like life. Because life does that, doesn't it? People get sick, families have emergencies. And she'd never once, in the whole time I'd known her, asked me for a thing she didn't need. So when she mentioned it, and she mentioned it quietly, almost reluctantly, like she didn't want to bother me, I didn't think twice. She needed about 80,000 baht for hospital costs. That's roughly $2,500. I gave it to her that same day, no questions. She thanked me in that way. She had just a small nod, a look in the eyes, and that was that. A few weeks later, she told me her mom was doing better. The subject moved on. Then, a few months after that, there was a problem with the family land of country. Some kind of boundary dispute with a neighbor. She needed money for a lawyer to look into it. Another 60,000 baht. About $1,700. Again, reasonable. Again, the kind of thing that happens to families all the time. I handed it over without much thought. And then her daughter needed help with university fees. And then there was a repair needed on the roof of the family home, the same roof I'd helped with before, as it happened. But this time it was worse, she said. The wet season had been particularly bad. Each time the amount was modest. Each time there was a gap of a few weeks or a month before the next one came. Each time life went back to normal in between, and the whole thing reset, like the tide coming in and going out. You stop noticing the water rising if it does it slowly enough. By the end of 2018, if I'd actually sat down and added it all up, which I hadn't, and that's important, I was out about $25,000 to $30,000 on top of the original business investment, spread across maybe 8 or 9 separate payments over the course of about 18 months. None of them huge, none of them alarming on their own. It was around this time that the little signs started appearing, not big ones, not the kind of thing you'd slap your forehead about and say, obviously, how did I miss that, smaller than that, quieter. For one thing, I started noticing that the business documents were never quite ready. I'd ask, casually, how things were progressing with the guest house. And she'd say it was all being handled, or that there was some paperwork still being sorted out, or that she was just waiting on someone to get back to her. And I'd nod and move on, because pushing felt ungrateful, like I was questioning her. And I didn't want to do that, not after everything she'd done for me. I also had a Thai mate by this point, not an expat, an actual Thai bloke I'd got to know through the cafe. Good fella, got sarp. One afternoon he said something to me that I've thought about a lot since. We were talking about nothing in particular, and he just said, casually, like it was advice about the weather, be careful with family. Bazza. Family is very important here, very expensive sometimes. And I nodded and said, yeah, no worries, mate. And that was the end of it. I didn't think about what he was really saying, not then. There was one afternoon at the cafe that sticks with me, though. One of the other expats, an English bloke, been there a few years. Decent enough he'd had a couple of beers, and he looked at me sideways and said, mate, have you actually seen any paperwork for this business of yours? And I remember the way I felt when he said it. Not suspicious, not worried, annoyed. Because it felt like he was implying something about her, about us, and I didn't want that. So I changed the subject, talked about the football, ordered another Chang, and the moment passed. But I'll tell you something. That night, lying in bed with the fan rattling above me and the sound of the street drifting up from outside, I opened the banking app on my phone and looked at my balance. Just looked at it. Didn't add anything up, didn't do any calculations. Just looked at the number and thought, huh. And then I put the phone down and went to sleep. I didn't think about it again for weeks. That's the honest truth. And that tells you everything you need to know about where my head was at, really. The door was there. Someone had practically knocked on it. But I didn't want to open it. Not yet. Not when things were still feeling all right, because they were. All right, I mean. She was still there, we were still together, the mornings still felt okay, the afternoons were still quiet. And that mattered more to me than the number in the account. At least, that's what I told myself. And then she came to me with an idea about some land. Now we're getting to the big one, the one that really matters. So pay attention here, yeah, because this is where everything changed. Even though it didn't feel like it at the time. At the time it felt like the most logical thing in the world. It was sometime in mid-2019. We were sitting together in the evening, the way we usually did, the fan going, the windows open, that thick, wet air coming in off the street, the smell of someone cooking some tam a few doors down, that pungent mix of lime and chili that you get used to after a while but never quite stop noticing. And she started talking about land. Not in the big way, not like she was pitching something. She was talking about a plot upcountry, somewhere in Isan, near where her family was from. She knew the area well. She knew the land. And she laid it out the way she laid everything out, calmly, practically, with that quiet confidence that had always made me trust her judgment. The plot was available. The price was fair. It could be developed down the track or just held as an investment. Either way, it was a good deal. The kind of thing that didn't come along often. The price she gave me was about 1.2 million baht. Roughly $35,000. A significant chunk. The biggest single amount she'd ever mentioned. But against what I still had in the account, which was still comfortably over 100,000 at that point, it didn't feel dangerous. It felt like a smart move. The kind of thing a sensible person would do. And then she got to the part one already knew was coming. She said, very matter-of-factly, that of course a Farang couldn't put land in his own name in Thailand. That was just the law. Foreigners couldn't own land, only condos, and even then there were limits. So if I wanted to be part of this, the land would need to go in a Thai name, hers, or someone in the family now. I want to be straight with you here. I knew this. I'd known it for years. It's one of the first things any expat learns, usually the hard way. You can't own land in Thailand if you're foreign. Full stop. And I'd heard the horror stories too. Blokes who'd put property in their girlfriend's name and come home one day to find the locks changed. Blokes who'd build houses on land that was never theirs to begin with and lost the lot overnight. I'd heard all of it, every version. But here's the thing about hearing a warning about someone else and then being in the situation yourself. They're not the same thing, not even close. Because when it's you, when it's someone you've spent 4 years trusting, someone who has never once given you a reason not to the warning, sounds like it belongs to a different story, someone else's story, not yours. She said, everyone does it like this. And she was right. It was the standard arrangement. Hundreds, maybe thousands of expats in Thailand had done exactly the same thing. Put property in a partner's name because there was no other way. It didn't mean anything sinister. It was just how it worked. So I said yes. The money went across in 2 payments. About 600,000 baht each time, spread over a couple of weeks. And she said the paperwork would be sorted. The title deed, the transfer documentation, all of it. She just needed a bit of time to get it all through the system. These things take a while, she said. But it would be done. I nodded, and I waited. Weeks went by, then a month, then 2. And every time I asked gently, because I didn't want to seem pushy, she'd say it was being handled, nearly done, just waiting on someone. And I'd say, right, no worries. Because that's what I did. I didn't push. Pushing felt like a lack of trust, and trust was the only thing holding the whole arrangement together. So I let it go. Every single time. About 3 months after the money had moved, she suggested we go up to Isan to see the land. A trip up country. I thought that was a good idea. Felt reassuring, actually. Seeing it with my own eyes, making it real. So we went. Took the overnight bus up north, the kind that rattles your teeth loose and smells like someone's been eating durian in the back row. Got off at a provincial bus station in the early morning, the light already hot and white, and took a Somtayu out into the countryside. Red dirt roads. Rice paddies stretched flat in every direction. Dogs sleeping under wooden houses. The whole landscape so green and quiet, it almost felt like it couldn't be real. She took me to a plot, pointed it out, said, "This is it." And I looked at it. And something didn't sit quite right. I can't tell you exactly what it was, not precisely. It wasn't that the land was obviously worthless, or that it was in some terrible state. It was more that it didn't match what she'd described. The size felt off. The location relative to the road felt different from what she'd talked about. And when I asked a couple of questions where the boundary markers were, what was on the other side, the answers were a bit vague, a bit hand-wavy. She pointed at things in the distance and said, "Over there, like that," and I wanted to believe her because we'd come all this way, and the alternative was too uncomfortable to sit with, so I nodded, and I said it looked good, and we went back to Hua Hin the next day. But something had shifted. Something small, something I couldn't quite name, had gotten into my head and wouldn't quite leave. It got worse over the next few months. Little things. Her family, when we visited them, were less warm than they'd been before. Not unfriendly exactly. Just different. Quieter around me. Avoiding eye contact in a way that felt deliberate. And when I asked her about it, she said it was nothing. Just how they were. People get busy. Life goes on. And the documents still weren't ready. I started to feel it then. That low hum in the chest that you get when something's not adding up but you can't work out exactly what it is. Like hearing a strange noise on the ship at night and knowing it's probably nothing but not being able to sleep anyway. One night, this would have been early 2021, I think I was lying in bed and I couldn't switch my brain off. And for the first time, without meaning to, I started doing the maths in my head. Not just the land, everything, the business, her mom, the roof, the lawyer, the university fees, the land, all of it, added up, one thing after another, in the dark, with the fan going and the street quiet outside. And when I got to the end of it, the number was bigger than I'd thought. A lot bigger. Somewhere around $70,000 or $80,000, give or take. Against the $160,000 I'd started with, more than half, gone. Quietly, bit by bit, over 4 years. I lay there for a long time after that. Staring at the ceiling, not panicking, not even angry really. Just sitting with the number, letting it settle. The next morning I didn't mention it to her, and she didn't mention it to me. We had breakfast together the way we always did, and the sun came through the window and the whole thing felt completely normal. But a week or so later, I tried to bring it up. Casually. Just asked how things were going with the title deed on the land, whether there was a timeline on when we'd have the paperwork in hand. And she looked at me and she said, "Everything is fine, Bazza. You don't need to worry about this." And I heard something in her voice that I hadn't heard before, or maybe I had, and I'd just been choosing not to notice. It was a tone that felt like a door being shut, gently, politely, but shut all the same. I didn't ask again, not for a while. Right. So this is the part of the story where everything changes, and I want to be upfront about something before I get into it, because I think it matters. When I tell you what happened next, you might think, well, finally he woke up. Someone shook him out of it. And in a way, yeah, that's true. But it's not quite as clean as that. It wasn't one moment. It was more like a crack appearing in something you'd been leaning against for years, and suddenly realizing the whole structure might not be as solid as you thought. It started at the cafe, mid-2021, one of those thick, humid afternoons where the air sits on you like a wet blanket, and even the ceiling fans don't seem to be doing much. I was there on my own, having a Leo, watching the street, and this younger bloke sat down at the next table new to Hua Hin. Hadn't been there more than a few weeks, by the look of him. Still had that slightly lost expression that all the new arrivals have, like they're not quite sure how they ended up here. He got talking to me, the way people do in those cafes, and after a bit of small talk, he started telling me his story, why he'd come to Thailand, what had happened to him. And the details were different from mine, completely different situation, different woman, different set of circumstances, but the shape of it. The shape was the same, the slow trust, the gradual involvement, the money moving in small amounts that each made sense on their own, the paperwork that was always coming but never quite arriving. I listened to the whole thing without saying a word, and something happened in my chest while he was talking. Something shifted, like a lock turning that I hadn't even known was there. It wasn't suspicion, not exactly. It was more like recognition. Like hearing someone describe a coastline you've sailed past a dozen times but never actually looked at properly, and suddenly seeing the rocks underneath. That night I didn't sleep much. The next morning I did something I should have done years ago. I found a lawyer, not through her, that's important, not through anyone connected to her. I asked around, quietly, at the cafe. The English bloke, the one who'd asked me about the paperwork all those months back, he knew someone. A Thai lawyer in town who dealt with property cases involving foreigners. Spoke good English, came recommended. So I rang him up and made an appointment and went in on my own, without telling anyone. The lawyer's office was on the second floor of a building near the market, small, neat. A desk with a Thai flag on it and a stack of manila folders that looked like they contained other people's disasters. I sat down and told him what I needed. Simple as that. I wanted a property records check on the land deal, the plot in Isan. I gave him the details I had, which, looking back, wasn't as much as it should have been, and he said he'd look into it. Said it would take a couple of weeks. So I waited. And the waiting was the hardest part, honestly, because during those 2 weeks I had to keep acting normal, going back to the apartment, sitting with her in the evenings, eating meals together, watching the street, laughing at the right moments, all the while knowing that somewhere across town a bloke was pulling at a thread that might unravel the whole bloody thing. The call came on a Tuesday afternoon. The lawyer rang me and asked me to come in. His voice was even professional, not the kind of voice that tells you anything before you get there. So I went in, and I sat down, and he laid it out for me. The land existed, that was the first thing he said, and I remember thinking, well, at least that's something. The land was real. But the ownership trail, the chain of names on the title, the transfer history was tangled, not in an obvious, blatant way, not like someone had forged a signature and been caught out. It was more complicated than that. The name on the title wasn't hers. It was a family member's. And that family member had, at some point, transferred part of the stake to someone else. And there was no documentation anywhere that connected any of it back to me or to any agreement I'd made. In other words, the money I'd paid for that land had gone somewhere. But as far as the official records were concerned, I had no claim to anything. I sat there for a minute just looking at him, and he said, quite calmly, this is very common, and very difficult to prosecute. Yeah, I remember thinking that was a hell of a thing to say to someone, but he wasn't being cruel about it. He was being honest. And honestly, I think I needed someone to be honest with me right then more than I needed anything else in the world. I went home that evening and I didn't say anything to her straight away. I sat on the balcony for a long time, watching the light go out over the rooftops, and I thought about it. Turned it over. Looked at it from every angle, the way I would have looked at a navigation problem on the ship, trying to work out where I actually was. It took me a couple of days to bring it up, and when I did, I want you to understand how I did it, because I'm not a man who shouts, never have been. 32 years on ships, you learn that raising your voice in a tight situation doesn't fix anything. It just makes everything worse. So I was calm, measured. I sat her down and I told her very quietly what the lawyer had said, what the record showed, and I asked her to explain it to me. And she did, or she tried to. She had answers for everything. The family member thing was just how it was done in that area, she said. The transfer was routine. The paperwork was still being sorted. It would all work out in the end. And here's the thing that really gets me. Even now, some of it sounded believable, not all of it, but some of it. Because she was good at that, she'd always been good at that. Saying things in a way that made you want to believe them, because the alternative was too painful to look at. but I couldn't unhear what the lawyer had said, and I couldn't unsee what was in those records. So even though her explanations were plausible, they weren't convincing. Not anymore. The door I'd been keeping shut for years had finally come open, and no amount of calm reassurance was going to close it again. The relationship didn't end that day, or that week. It dissolved. Slowly, over the next month or so, like salt in water. The conversations got shorter. The silences got longer. We stopped eating together in the evenings. She started spending more time away from the apartment, and I started spending more time at the cafe, on my own, with a Leo, staring at the street and not seeing any of it. It was during one of those afternoons that I sat down and did the full audit. Every transfer I could remember, every amount, every date I could piece together from my bank records, which I finally, properly, went through for the first time. I wrote it all down on a piece of paper, A4, front and back, in pencil, because I kept having to change the numbers as I remembered things more clearly. When I finished, the total was sitting somewhere around $90,000, give or take $90,000, over 6 years, in amounts that ranged from a couple of hundred to over 30,000. None of it documented, none of it recoverable as far as the lawyer could tell me. I rang him back the next day and asked him straight out, what are my options here? What can I actually do about this? And he was quiet for a second. And then he said, honestly, Mr. Bazza, your options are very limited. The money has moved. The property is not in your name. There is no written agreement. In Thai law, this is very difficult to challenge. I thanked him and hung up. And then I sat there in the quiet of the office for a long time, looking at nothing. Because here's the thing that no one tells you about finding out you've been done over. The worst part isn't the money. The money's just a number. It hurts, yeah. It stings. But it's abstract in a way that you can hold at arm's length if you need to. The worst part is realizing that some of it was real. Some of the warmth. Some of the laughter. Some of those evenings on the balcony watching the sun go down. Some of that was genuine. And you can't work out which bits were and which bits weren't. And because you can't, you end up doubting all of it. Every single moment. And that's the thing that actually breaks you, not the money. The not knowing. So, here we are then. I know what you're expecting me to say. You're expecting me to tell you I packed up and flew back to Australia, got on a plane, went home, licked my wounds, started over somewhere familiar. And honestly, for a while there, that's exactly what I thought I was going to do. I sat with that plan for weeks, turned it over, looked at flights, looked at what it would cost to set myself up back in Queensland, ran the numbers the way I run everything methodically, quietly, on my own. But I didn't do it. And I know that's the bit that makes people uncomfortable, the bit where the story doesn't end the way they want it to. So let me try to explain why. Because it's not as simple as stubbornness, or denial, or not having anywhere to go back to. It's more complicated than that. The first few months after everything came out were bad. I'm not going to dress that up. They were genuinely bad, not dramatic bad, not falling apart in public bad, just a quiet, gray kind of bad that settled over everything like dust. I moved out of the apartment, couldn't stay there, obviously. Found a smaller place, cheaper, further back from the waterfront. About 5,500 baht a month. Stripped down nothing I didn't need. I cut back on everything. Ate from the market stalls, drank less. Spent most of my days sitting and not doing much of anything. It wasn't depression exactly. Or maybe it was. I don't know. I've never been much good at naming things like that. It was more like the whole world had gone a bit flat. Like someone had turned the color down on everything, and I couldn't find the dial to turn it back up. The mornings still came. The heat was still there. The sounds of the street were still the same. The motorbikes, the vendors calling out, the dogs barking at nothing. But it all felt like it was happening to someone else, and I was just watching it from a bit of a distance. I didn't talk to anyone about it, not properly, not for a while. The expat mates I'd drifted away from during the years with her. I started seeing them again, at the cafe, but at first it was just sitting there, having a beer, not saying much, which suited me fine because I didn't have much to say. But then, bit by bit, over the course of a few months, I started talking. Not about the feelings, not about how I was coping or any of that. I talked about what had happened, the facts of it, the money, the land, the documents that never came. And what I noticed, when I started doing that, was that other blokes had stories. Similar ones, not identical, but the same shape, the same slow progression, the same rationalizations, the same moment where you realize the door's been open for years and you just chose not to walk through it. And something about hearing it from other people made it easier to sit with in myself, not better, exactly, just less lonely. Which, if I'm being honest, is probably the closest I've ever come to understanding what I actually needed when I first came to Thailand all those years ago. The money situation, when I finally looked at it properly, and I mean properly with a calculator and a clear head, was this. I'd started with about $160,000. The total that had gone out over the decade, across everything, was somewhere around 90,000, give or take. That left me with roughly $70,000. Not nothing. Not enough to live on forever, not at the rate I'd been spending, but enough to be comfortable for a while, if I was careful. Which I was. I'm careful now. I stayed in Thailand because, and this is going to sound strange, it was still the place that made the most sense. I didn't have a life to go back to in Australia, not really. The house was gone. The mates I'd had there had moved on, the way mates do when you disappear for a decade without much explanation. My wife's family had their own lives. There was nothing pulling me back. And here, for all the damage that had been done, I still had the mornings, the coffee, the walk along the waterfront, the cafe, the market, the heat and the noise and the smell of moo ping sizzling on a grill at 7 in the morning. Thailand hadn't betrayed me. One person in Thailand had taken advantage of me. And those are not the same thing, even though it took me a long time to separate the two. People ask me now, and I do get asked, more than you'd think, because word gets around among the expats. They ask me what I'd do differently. And the answer isn't what you'd expect. It's not, I wouldn't have trusted her, or I would have got the paperwork sorted, or I would have checked the records sooner. I mean, yeah, all of those things are true, obviously. But that's not really the point. The point is this. I came here empty. I came here with a hole in me that I didn't even know was there, or if I did know, I didn't want to look at it. And that hole was the thing that made everything else possible. Not her, not Thailand, me. The emptiness I was carrying when I walked off that plane in Bangkok. That was the thing that did it. Because when you're that empty, you fill up on whatever's closest. And she was closest. And it felt good. It felt warm. And for a long time, years, actually it genuinely was. Some of it was real. I believe that. I have to believe that. Otherwise, the whole 10 years becomes nothing, and I refuse to let it be nothing. There were good mornings in there. There were afternoons that mattered. There was a version of a life that wasn't perfect, but wasn't bad either. And I lived it. For better or worse, I actually lived it. I'm 65 now. I've got enough money to keep going for a while if I'm sensible about it. I've got the cafe. I've got a few people I can sit with in comfortable silence. I've got the waterfront and the walks and the sound of the market opening up in the morning. It's not what I planned, but then I never had a plan. Not really, not from the day I sold that house in Karen's. I just had the sea, and then I had this. And maybe that's all there ever was. And that, folks, is Bazza's story. Now I want you to sit with that for a second before you close this video, because I know a lot of you are going to walk away from this one thinking, right, another bloke who got taken for a ride in Thailand. And yeah, on the surface, that's exactly what this is. A man lost $90,000 to someone he trusted. The paperwork was never there. The property was never really his. The warning signs were there from the start if he'd been looking for them. But here's the thing. Bazza wasn't really looking for warning signs. He was looking for somewhere to belong. And that's not a Thailand problem. That's a very human one. This is one of the most common shapes these stories take on this channel. Not the flashy scams. Not the ones that happen in a week or two down on Walking Street. The slow ones. The ones that take years. The ones where the person doing the losing is also the person who can't quite bring themselves to stop. Because stopping means admitting that the thing they were holding on to wasn't what they thought it was. If you're thinking about a move like this to Thailand, or anywhere else, the warning in this story isn't don't go. It's know what you're actually looking for when you get there, because if you don't, something else is going to figure it out for you, and it won't be gentle about it. That's all for today. If this one hit you, if it made you think, hit subscribe, share it with someone you think needs to hear it, and if you've got your own story, your own version of what happened to Bazza, you know where to find us. This is Thailand. Take care of yourselves out there.